At midnight, an island blinked and a tycoon vanished. Welcome to the Silent Clue Works. I am your host, Echo of Silence. Comment where you're listening from. I cherish every note. Stay close. The story begins. When a man worth 8 figures shows up at your door after midnight, he has already made 2 fundamental errors in judgment. First, he believes his money grants him immunity from the normal rules of civilized behavior. Second, he assumes that Nero Wolfe will interrupt his sleep for anything short of the building catching fire. It was 12 minutes past midnight on a Tuesday in late October when the doorbell began its insistent complaint. I was in my room, trying to decide whether a mystery novel about a poisoned philanthropist was worth finishing, or whether I should use it to prop up the wobbly leg on my nightstand. The bell kept ringing with the persistence of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. My job description includes many unpleasant duties, but answering the door for drunks, insomniacs, and emergency cases of wounded pride is not among them. However, it does include preventing disturbances that might wake Wolfe before his customary 8 hours of beauty sleep have elapsed. Don't. I pulled on a robe and went downstairs, snapping on the hall light and opening the door on the chain. The man on the stoop looked like he owned half of Manhattan and was shopping for the other half. Tall, silver-haired, late 50s, wearing a coat that had cost more than most people earn in a month. Behind him at the curb sat a black sedan with a driver who was trying very hard to look like he was not memorizing the license plates of every car on the block. "You are Archie Goodwin," the man said. His voice had the texture of aged whiskey and the patience of a man accustomed to being obeyed immediately. "I need to see Nero Wolfe. Tonight." "That is a popular fantasy," I told him. "Right up there with owning a unicorn. Mr. Wolfe sees clients by appointment during business hours, which are 11 to 1 and 4 to 6. You can try again when the sun is up and rational people are vertical." He did not smile, argue, or threaten. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and produced a leather wallet. For a moment I shifted my weight to the balls of my feet, but what emerged was identification, not a weapon. The name inside was Preston Harwick, and beneath it was a list of corporations, foundations, and financial institutions that would make the Treasury Department weep with envy. "Congratulations," I said. "You have convinced me that your accountant works harder than mine." Mr. Wolfe still does not take midnight appointments, even from men whose signatures make banks genuflect. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, and this time there was something raw beneath the polish, something that money had not been able to smooth away. "I'm not here to flaunt my portfolio. I'm here because someone I trusted has betrayed me, and by dawn it may be too late to prevent a disaster that will destroy more than my reputation. This concerns Mr. Wolfe, whether he knows it or not." That was a new angle. Usually the line involves saving Western civilization or at least preventing the collapse of the stock market. Having Wolfe dragged into someone else's crisis without his consent was different enough to be interesting. "You're telling me that a stranger is out there plotting against my employer?" I said. "Because if that is the case, I should warn you that the last person who tried it ended up wishing he had taken up stamp collecting instead. I'm telling you that someone is preparing to use Mr. Wolfe without his knowledge or consent," Harwick replied. "As a model, as justification for actions he would never condone. Tonight I received a signal from my private island, a lighthouse signal that was never supposed to be used." He paused, and I could see the fine sheen of perspiration on his forehead despite the October chill. Up close, he looked like a man who had been running from something and was not sure he had gotten far enough ahead of it. "From where?" I asked. "The Coast Guard? Your conscience? A disgruntled lighthouse keeper?" "From Gull Point Island," he said. 30 miles northeast of Montauk. A private retreat I use for confidential business meetings. At 11:45 tonight, the lighthouse there began transmitting a coded sequence. Not the standard maritime signals. A pattern I established years ago as an emergency warning. It means immediate danger. Betrayal in progress. You and Paul Revere should start a club, I observed. Why not use a telephone like everyone else in the 20th century? Because the man sending the signal cannot safely use a telephone, Harwick answered. And because the island is supposed to be secure. No one approaches it without my knowledge. If the emergency signal has been activated, it means my security has been compromised and someone I trust has turned against me. This is all very dramatic, I said, but I am still waiting for the part where Mr. Wolfe enters the picture. 6 hours ago, a confidential document was stolen from my New York office, he said, a financial analysis that could destabilize international markets if used improperly. The thief was someone with access to my private files. He disappeared this evening, and then the island signaled. I believe he is being coerced into participating in a scheme that will use Mr. Wolfe's reputation to cover. I looked past him at the waiting car. The driver had the posture of a man who expected his employer to explode without warning and wanted to be ready to duck. How exactly would they use Mr. Wolfe's name? I asked. The stolen document references a case he solved 2 years ago involving currency manipulation, Harwick said. The pattern of moves they are planning will appear, to anyone who investigates, to be the work of Nero Wolfe. If the scheme succeeds, he will be credited. If it fails and people are ruined, he will be blamed. They admire his methods. They intend to copy them without his scruples. And there it was, glowing like his lighthouse beacon. You can borrow Wolfe's techniques, you can even steal his clients, but you cannot use his name as a shield for criminal activity and expect him to remain philosophical about it. I shut the door long enough to release the chain, then opened it wide. Come in, I said. You have earned yourself a chance to wake a sleeping genius. If you are lying to me, I will personally ensure that you regret it long before he gets around to expressing his displeasure. Harwick stepped into the hall, bringing with him the scent of expensive cologne and the kind of desperation that no amount of money can disguise. I closed the door on the night, knowing that somewhere above us, a very large man was about to have his sleep interrupted by a case he had not asked for, but would not be able to refuse. Leaving Harwick standing in the hall like a statue of expensive anxiety, I climbed the stairs to commit what amounts to professional suicide in our household. Waking Nero Wolfe after midnight ranks somewhere between arson and treason in his personal code of unforgivable offenses. I paused outside his bedroom door, listening to the rhythmic rumble of his breathing, a sound like distant thunder rolling across peaceful hills. The man sleeps with the same deliberate precision he brings to everything else, and interrupting that process is not undertaken lightly. I knocked twice, firmly but not aggressively, and waited. The breathing stopped. There was a silence that stretched long enough for me to contemplate alternative careers, preferably in distant cities where large men in yellow pajamas could not reach me. Then his voice came through the door, thick with sleep and displeasure. Archie, if the building is not on fire, you're about to become unemployed. I opened the door and stepped just inside. The room was dark except for the pale glow from the street lamp outside, and I could make out his massive form beneath the covers, a mountain range of silk and indignation. A man named Preston Harwick is downstairs, I said. He claims someone is planning to commit financial fraud using your reputation as cover. They have stolen a document that references your currency manipulation case and intend to execute a scheme that will either credit you with genius or blame you for disaster, depending on how it plays out. He needs your help before dawn. The silence that followed was different from the first one. This was the silence of a mind engaging, wheels turning, possibilities being weighed and measured. I heard the bed creak as he shifted position. Using my name, he said, not merely copying my methods. Exactly. According to Harwick, they admire your work but lack your scruples. The stolen analysis contains specific references to your techniques, and they plan to use those references to legitimize their operation. Your name becomes both their inspiration and their shield. Another creak. I knew that sound. It meant Wolfe was sitting up, which meant the case had already captured his interest, despite his irritation at the hour. "What is this man Harwick to you?" he asked. "Nothing. He appeared on our doorstep 20 minutes ago with a story about lighthouse signals and missing employees. I would have sent him away, but the part about unauthorized use of the Wolfe method seemed like something you would want to address personally." "Indeed," Wolfe said, and there was something in his voice that suggested Harwick had chosen his bait wisely. "Send him to the office. I will be down presently. And Archie, if this proves to be an elaborate fiction designed to secure my services under false pretenses, you will be the one explaining it to the unemployment office." I understood and retreated before he could elaborate on the specific forms of retribution he had in mind. Downstairs, I found Fritz moving quietly through the kitchen in his night clothes, preparing a coffee service with the supernatural efficiency that marks all his domestic operations. He had heard the commotion and anticipated the need without being asked. "A client at this hour," he observed softly. "Mr. Wolfe will not be pleased." "Mr. Wolfe is never pleased when his routine is violated," I replied. "But this one brought a story interesting enough to get him vertical, so he may escape the worst of his displeasure." I collected Harwick from the hall and guided him to the office, turning on the lights to reveal the familiar sanctuary of books, files, and comfortable chairs where so many confessions had been extracted and mysteries unraveled. I directed him to the red leather chair reserved for clients and took my position at my desk, notebook ready. "Mr. Wolfe will be down shortly," I told him. "I suggest you organize your thoughts and prepare to present your case without embellishment or dramatics. He has no patience for either under the best of circumstances, and these are not the best of circumstances." Harwick nodded, settling into the chair with the careful movements of a man trying to control his nerves. He clasped his hands together and stared at the empty chair behind the desk as though willing it to fill itself with the solution to his problems. The elevator descended with its familiar clatter, followed by the heavy, measured tread of footsteps in the hallway. Wolfe entered the office, wearing his yellow silk pajamas beneath a dressing gown that could have served as a circus tent. He did not acknowledge Harwick immediately. Instead, he went to his desk, adjusted the position of his letter opener to achieve perfect alignment with the blotter, and lowered himself into his chair with the deliberate care of a man parking an expensive piece of machinery. He picked up the beer bottle Fritz had provided, examined it briefly, and set it aside unopened. Only then did he turn his attention to our visitor, fixing him with a stare that could have frozen Mercury in July. "Mr. Harwick," he said, "you have violated a household rule that admits no exceptions. It is after midnight. I do not receive clients at this hour. You have 5 minutes to justify this intrusion before I have you removed from the premises." Harwick straightened in his chair, and when he spoke his voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being taken seriously by important people. "6 hours ago," he began, "a confidential document was stolen from my private office. The document contains a detailed financial analysis, commissioned as a theoretical exercise, exploring vulnerabilities in international currency markets. One section specifically references your work on the Balkanian exchange manipulation case, using your methods as a template for potential market intervention. The thief was someone with authorized access to my secure files. At 11:45 tonight, my private island transmitted an emergency signal indicating immediate danger and internal betrayal." Wolfe's eyes were nearly closed, but I recognized the expression. He was absorbing every detail, constructing frameworks of possibility, identifying the critical questions that would need answers. "This signal," Wolfe said. "Explain its nature and significance." "Gull Point Island operates a lighthouse for navigation," Harwick replied. "But I installed a secondary system years ago, an emergency communication method for situations where conventional contact might be compromised. a specific sequence of light patterns that means betrayal in progress, immediate danger. Tonight, that sequence was transmitted. Someone on the island is warning me, but they cannot safely use normal communication channels. Who has access to this signal system? 3 people. Myself, my head of security who disappeared after the document theft, and my personal assistant who was supposed to be coordinating a confidential meeting on the island tonight. One of them is the traitor. One of them sent the signal. The third may already be dead. Wolfe opened his eyes fully and regarded Harwick with an expression that suggested he was reassessing both the man and his story. You operate clandestine facilities using emergency signals, employ people who steal documents and vanish into the night, and conduct confidential meetings that require such elaborate security measures. This does not suggest an organization notable for its stability or transparency. Harwick's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. I built my fortune by taking calculated risks with carefully vetted people, Mr. Wolfe. Until tonight, that system has never failed me. I'm here because someone has betrayed that trust in a way that threatens not only my interests but your reputation. If you refuse to help, you will wake tomorrow to find your name attached to a financial scandal you had no part in creating. Wolfe was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming a slow rhythm on the arm of his chair. Then he reached for the beer bottle, opened it with practiced efficiency, and poured the contents into his glass. The foam rose to the rim and stopped, perfect and precise. "Very well," he said. "I will consider taking this case with conditions. You will place yourself entirely at my disposal until the matter is resolved. You will attempt no independent action without my approval, and you will answer without evasion or omission when I ask you to identify which person on that island you fear most." Harwick nodded quickly. "Any conditions you require." Wolfe turned to me. "Archie, you will obtain complete details regarding Mr. Harwick's associates, his island facility, and the specific nature of the stolen analysis. Then you will accompany him to this island and investigate the situation firsthand. I will not stir from this house, but you will serve as my eyes and ears in this matter." I looked at the clock on the wall. It was approaching 1:30 in the morning. "Gull Point Island is 30 miles northeast of Montauk," I observed. "That puts us there around dawn, assuming we can arrange transportation at this hour and assuming the people on the island are still alive to be investigated." "Mr. Harwick will provide transportation," Wolfe said. "As for the other assumption, that is precisely what you're going to determine. This case involves the unauthorized appropriation of my intellectual property for criminal purposes. That is an offense I do not tolerate, regardless of the hour or the inconvenience involved in addressing it." He lifted his glass and took a measured sip, his eyes never leaving Harwick's face. "We begin immediately. The helicopter ride to Montauk took 53 minutes, during which I learned more about Preston Harwick's private empire than most shareholders would discover in a lifetime of annual reports. We flew through the pre-dawn darkness in a machine that probably cost more than Wolfe spends on beer in a decade, while Harwick used the noise of the rotors as cover to brief me on the cast of characters I was about to meet. The stolen document had been authored by Dr. Marcus Dryden, Harwick's head of security and the architect of the island's emergency communication system. Dryden was former federal law enforcement, methodical and paranoid in the professional sense, with 8 years of absolute loyalty to his employer. He had vanished from Harwick's Manhattan office sometime after 6 in the evening, taking the theoretical analysis with him. Whether he had stolen it or been coerced into taking it remained an open question, but his disappearance coincided too neatly with the island's distress signal to be coincidental. The second person with signal access was Catherine Voss, Harwick's personal assistant and the woman who effectively ran his daily operations. She had been with him for 6 years, knew his secrets, managed his schedule, and coordinated the kind of confidential meetings that required private islands and emergency communication systems. She had traveled to Gull Point the previous afternoon to prepare for tonight's gathering. If the signal was genuine, she was either in danger or dead. If it was false, she was the most likely candidate to have sent it. The third person was Evan Harwick, Preston's nephew and the nominal manager of the island facility. He was 32, brilliant with financial analysis, and had been placed in charge of Harwick's most sensitive research projects. According to his uncle, Evan had studied Wolfe's methods obsessively, particularly the Balkanian currency case, and had insisted that Wolfe's techniques be referenced in the stolen analysis. He was supposed to be on the island coordinating tonight's meeting, but Harwick had not been able to reach him since the signal began. As we approached the dark shape of Gull Point Island, I could see why Harwick had chosen it for confidential business. It was a rocky outcrop about half a mile long, isolated enough to discourage casual visitors and small enough to control completely. The lighthouse stood at the northern end like a white finger pointing at the sky, but its beam was dark and the emergency signal had stopped flashing. The main house occupied the center of the island, a modern structure that looked like it had been designed by someone who confused expensive with tasteful. The pilot set us down on a cleared area near the house with a kind of precision that suggested he had made this approach many times before. As the rotors wound down and the noise faded, the island's silence pressed in around us. No lights showed in the house windows. No figures emerged to greet us. The only sound was the distant crash of waves against rock and the cry of gulls disturbed by our arrival. Harwick led the way up a gravel path to the front door, moving with the careful steps of a man who was beginning to understand that his carefully controlled world had slipped its moorings. The door was unlocked, which in a place like this meant either supreme confidence or complete disaster. We stepped into a large entrance hall that smelled of expensive furniture and something else, something metallic that made my hand move instinctively toward my shoulder holster. The house felt empty, but not abandoned. Coffee cups sat on side tables, still warm. Papers were scattered across a desk in what appeared to be the middle of some kind of analysis. Coats hung on chairs, as if their owners had stepped out for a moment and would return shortly. Everything suggested normal occupancy, suddenly interrupted. We found Catherine Voss in the kitchen, sitting at a breakfast table with her hands folded in front of her and a look of controlled panic in her eyes. She was a woman in her early 30s, attractive in the efficient way of someone who had learned to use her appearance as a professional tool. When she saw Harwick, she stood quickly, relief flooding her face. "Preston, thank God," she said. "I've been trying to reach you for hours. The communication system is down. The lighthouse controls have been sabotaged, and Evan is missing." Harwick stopped in the doorway, and I could see him reassessing everything he thought he knew about the situation. "Missing how?" he asked. "He went to check the lighthouse around 11 last night," she replied. "When the emergency signal started flashing, he said he would shut it down and return in a few minutes. That was 6 hours ago. I searched the entire island. He is not here." I stepped forward, notebook ready. "Miss Voss, I am Archie Goodwin. I work for Nero Wolfe. Mr. Harwick has asked us to investigate what happened here. I need you to tell me exactly what you observed, in sequence, without interpretation." She looked at Harwick for confirmation, got a nod, then turned back to me with the focused attention of someone who understood that precision might be the difference between life and death. "Evan and I had dinner at 7, she began. "We reviewed the agenda for this morning's meeting. Around 10:30, we were in the study going over some financial projections when the lighthouse beam changed. Instead of the normal navigation pattern, it began flashing the emergency sequence. Evan immediately went to investigate. He took a flashlight and headed for the lighthouse. I waited here. When he did not return after an hour, I tried to follow, but the path was dark and I was afraid of getting lost on the rocks. "And Dr. Drayden?" I asked. "When did you last see him?" "Yesterday afternoon in New York," she said. "He was supposed to travel here this morning with the quarterly security assessment. But he never arrived, and when I tried to call his office, there was no answer." I made notes while she talked, watching her face for the small tells that indicate deception or concealment. She was frightened, certainly, but there was something else beneath the fear, a calculation as if she was weighing each word before she spoke it. "Miss Voss," I said, "who else knows about the emergency signal system?" "Just the three of us," she replied immediately. "Preston, Evan, and Dr. Dryden. It was installed for situations exactly like this, when normal communication might be compromised. But you did not send the signal yourself." "No," she said. "I do not have access to the lighthouse controls. Only Evan and Dr. Dryden knew the technical procedures, which meant either Evan had sent the signal before disappearing, or someone else had forced him to activate it." Neither possibility suggested a pleasant evening ahead. Harwick was pacing now, his executive composure cracking under the weight of too many missing pieces. "We need to search the lighthouse," he said. "If Evan is hurt, if someone attacked him." I held up a hand. "We will search everything, but systematically. Miss Voss, is there anywhere else on the island where someone could hide? Caves, outbuildings, boat shelters. There is a generator building near the dock," she said, "and a small maintenance shed behind the house. But I checked both of them hours ago." "Nevertheless, we will check them again," I said. "In my experience, people who disappear on islands usually turn up in places that have already been searched. The question is whether they turn up alive or dead." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Somewhere on this rock, a man was missing, a security system had been compromised, and a document that could destabilize financial markets was in the hands of persons unknown. Wolfe had sent me to find answers, but what I was finding were more questions, each one more dangerous than the last. I looked at Catherine Voss, sitting perfectly composed despite the circumstances, and wondered what she was not telling me. Then I looked at Harwick, whose empire was crumbling around him while he stood in his own kitchen, and wondered if he was the victim or the architect of his own destruction. Either way, the sun was coming up, the markets would open in 3 hours, and somewhere in the darkness of Gull Point Island, the truth was waiting to be discovered. Whether any of us would survive the discovery remained to be seen. The lighthouse stood like a white sentinel against the gray dawn sky, its beacon dark and its emergency signal finally silent. As we approached along the rocky path, I could see that the door at the base stood slightly ajar, swinging in the morning breeze with the lazy persistence of something that had been left unfinished. Harwick stayed close behind me, his expensive shoes slipping occasionally on the damp stones, while Catherine remained at the house as I had suggested. In my experience, crime scenes are less cooperative when you have too many people trampling through them with their theories and emotions. The interior of the lighthouse smelled of salt air, old paint, and something metallic that made my hand drift toward my shoulder holster. The ground floor was a circular room containing maintenance equipment and a spiral staircase that climbed into the shadows above. Near the base of the stairs, a metal toolbox had been knocked over, its contents scattered across the concrete floor. Wrenches, screwdrivers, and electrical testing equipment lay where they had fallen, suggesting either hasty work or the kind of struggle that ends with someone getting hurt. I climbed the stairs carefully, listening for any sound from above and keeping my weight toward the outer edge where the metal was less likely to groan under pressure. The spiral ascended through 3 levels until I reached the observation room where the lighthouse mechanism and communication equipment were housed. What I found there was the work of someone with both technical knowledge and specific intent. The emergency signal system had been systematically destroyed. Wiring had been cut with precision, circuit boards removed, and the control panels smashed with what looked like a hammer. But the damage was selective, almost surgical. Whoever had done this knew exactly which components to destroy to disable the system while leaving the main lighthouse beacon operational. This was not random vandalism or the desperate flailing of an amateur. This was professional sabotage executed by someone who understood the equipment intimately. More interesting was what I found scattered near the destroyed control panel. A leather wallet containing identification for Dr. Marcus Dryden, complete with federal law enforcement credentials that had expired 2 years ago. Beside it was a cell phone with a cracked screen but still functional. I checked the recent calls carefully. The last outgoing call had been made at 11:47 the previous night, to a New York number I did not recognize. The call had lasted less than 30 seconds. I photographed everything with my phone, then pocketed Dryden's wallet and device. Wolfe would want to examine them personally. And I had learned long ago that removing evidence from crime scenes was acceptable when you were working for someone who solved crimes faster than the police could process paperwork. What I did not find was Evan Harwick, alive or dead. No blood, no signs of violence beyond the destroyed equipment. No convenient note explaining his whereabouts or intentions. Descending the stairs, I found Harwick waiting at the base with the expression of a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse in real time. "Your nephew was here," I told him. "Someone destroyed the emergency signal system with professional precision. I found Dr. Dryden's wallet and phone, but no sign of Evan himself. Either he left voluntarily after completing the sabotage, or someone removed him after he discovered what was happening." Harwick leaned against the wall as if his legs could no longer support him reliably. "Marcus was here," he said quietly. "On the island. All this time I thought he had stolen the document and fled, but he came here instead. No, someone brought his identification here to implicate him," I replied. "In my experience, criminals who leave their wallets at crime scenes are either extremely careless or extremely dead." We conducted a systematic search of the remaining structures. The generator building yielded nothing but machinery and fuel supplies. The maintenance shed contained the usual collection of tools, paint, and equipment that had been broken long enough to become part of the permanent inventory. But as we worked our way back toward the dock area, I found something that changed the complexion of the entire investigation. Near a bend in the path about 50 yards from the lighthouse, the ground showed signs of disturbance that did not match the natural disorder of wind and weather. Scuffed earth, a broken branch, and half hidden under a low bush, a slim metal object that caught the light when I bent close. It was a compact flashlight, the expensive kind that security professionals favor. The lens was cracked, and there was a brownish smear on the casing that had no business being there unless someone had been having a very bad evening. I photographed it from several angles, then wrapped it in my handkerchief and slipped it into my pocket. The discovery did not prove anything by itself, but it raised the odds that whatever had happened to Evan had happened before he reached the lighthouse. Which meant either he had been intercepted by someone who knew he was coming, or he had staged his own disappearance with more attention to drama than to efficiency. At the dock, I found additional evidence that our island was not as isolated as it appeared. Fresh scrape marks on the wooden pilings, low down near the waterline, and a smear of blue paint that did not match Harwick's white cruiser. "Someone else docked here recently," I said, pointing to the evidence. "Someone with a blue hull." Harwick stared at the paint as if it were a personal accusation. "Dryden has a boat," he whispered. "A blue fishing trawler. He uses it for weekend trips." Back at the house, I placed the damaged flashlight on the kitchen table with the care reserved for small bombs that might still harbor ambitions. Catherine went pale when she saw it and turned away. Harwick stared at it as if it were an unwelcome quarterly report that he could make disappear through concentrated disapproval. "Evans," he said. "I recognize the model. Dryden gave it to him last year as a Christmas gift. Where did you find it?" "On the path," I said. "Not far from the lighthouse, cracked with what appears to be blood on it. If your nephew is playing hide and seek, he is committed to the performance." Harwick moved to the sink and gripped the edge until his knuckles matched the porcelain. "Call Wolfe," he said without looking at me. "Now, tell him exactly what you found and ask him what we do next." I need access to your radio, I told him. The landline appears to be dead and cell service is non-existent out here. There is a shortwave unit in the boathouse, he replied. Independent power supply, marine frequencies. It should reach the mainland. 20 minutes later, I was speaking to Wolfe through the crackling static of a radio connection that made him sound like he was broadcasting from another planet. I gave him the details succinctly. The sabotaged lighthouse, Dryden's abandoned identification, the bloodied flashlight, and the evidence of a second boat. I also mentioned the growing tension between the missing security chief and the vanished nephew. So we have a closed circle with one member present, one missing, and one presumably absent but unaccounted for, Wolfe mused through the static, and physical evidence suggesting violence. Archie, you must determine the sequence of events, who arrived when, who left how, and most importantly, who is still there. If Dr. Dryden reached that island alive, he is either hiding or dead. If he is hiding, find him. If he is dead, find the body. The truth lies in the timeline. The connection broke with a snap of static that seemed to emphasize the isolation of our position. I turned to face Harwick and Catherine, both of whom were watching me with the desperate attention of people waiting for a verdict that would determine their immediate future. We are not leaving yet, I announced. Mr. Wolfe wants a complete accounting, and that means finding Dr. Dryden or determining conclusively that he is not here. We search every inch of this island, and we do it together. Because if there is a killer among us, I want to know where everyone is at all times. The morning sun was climbing higher, but the shadows on Gull Point Island seemed to be growing deeper. The systematic search of Gull Point Island began at dawn, with the methodical precision that Wolfe had drilled into me over the years. You start with what people actually use, he always said. Then work outward to what they might need, and finally to what they would choose only in desperation. We had covered the house and immediate grounds. Now it was time to examine the periphery where secrets tend to wash up like driftwood after a storm. I assigned Catherine the western shoreline while Harwick took the eastern approach, keeping them both within sight and earshot. The island's terrain was treacherous enough, without adding the possibility of additional disappearances to our growing collection of problems. I took the center path, moving south from the lighthouse toward the dock area where we had found evidence of the blue boat. The morning light revealed details that darkness had concealed. Near a cluster of wind-bent pines, I found a scrap of dark fabric caught on a thorn bush, flapping weakly in the salt breeze. The material was high-quality wool, the kind you find in custom suits rather than outdoor gear. I called the others over and held up the evidence. Someone came this way recently, I announced, and they were dressed for a boardroom, not a nature hike. Harwick examined the fabric with the expression of a man who recognized bad news when it was waved in front of him. That matches the suit Evan was wearing last night, he said quietly. Italian wool. He favored European tailoring. We tightened our search pattern around the area, following what appeared to be a disturbed path through the scrub toward the water. The trail led to a small inlet on the eastern side of the island, where the morning sun revealed something that made the fabric discovery seem optimistic by comparison. About 200 yards offshore, riding at anchor in the shelter of the inlet, was a blue fishing trawler. Through binoculars, I could read the name painted on the stern in white letters that had seen better decades. The rational mind, which struck me as either pretentious or prophetic, depending on your perspective on Dr. Dryden's current mental state. We need to board it, I said, lowering the glasses. If Dryden came here by boat, there may be evidence aboard that explains whether he arrived as a colleague or a criminal. The launch made short work of the distance to the mooring. As we approached, I could see that the trawler's deck was empty and the cabin door stood ajar, swinging slightly with the boat's motion. No welcoming committee, no signs of recent activity, just the creak of wood and the slap of water against the hull that boats make when they are waiting for owners who may never return. I boarded first, moving carefully and keeping my hand near my shoulder holster. The deck showed signs of use, but nothing obviously sinister. Fishing gear, coiled lines, a tackle box that had been opened and closed without particular care. The cabin was more revealing. Navigation charts were spread across the small table, showing the waters around Gull Point Island with notations in a precise hand. Tide calculations, approach routes, and a series of numbers that might have been coordinates or account numbers. More significant was what I discovered in the storage compartment beneath the bunk. A leather briefcase containing documents that matched Harwick's description of the stolen analysis. The theoretical study of currency manipulation, complete with references to Wolfe's Balkanian case and detailed projections of market vulnerabilities. But someone had annotated the margins extensively, converting academic theory into operational planning. The handwriting was different from the chart notations, suggesting two authors working from the same source material. I photographed every page before calling Harwick down to examine the contents. "This is the stolen document," he confirmed, his voice hollow with recognition. "But these annotations, this operational planning, this is not Marcus's work. The handwriting belongs to Evan." "So your security chief stole the analysis, brought it here, and discovered that your nephew had already converted it into an actionable scheme," I said. "That would certainly explain why someone activated the emergency signal. The question is what happened after that confrontation." We searched the rest of the boat methodically, but found nothing that explained the current whereabouts of either man. No blood, no signs of struggle, no helpful confession or suicide note. Just evidence that two men with opposing philosophies had converged on this island with a document that could destabilize markets and destroy reputations. Back on shore, I used the radio in the boathouse to contact Wolfe. His response came through the static with the measured deliberation of a man who was beginning to see patterns in the chaos. "You have established means and opportunity," he said. "The stolen analysis provides the weapon. The island provides the battlefield. What remains is to determine the sequence of engagement. When did Dryden arrive? When did the confrontation occur? When did someone disappear? The timeline will reveal the truth." I reviewed my notes, comparing Catherine's account with the physical evidence we had gathered. The emergency signal had begun at 11:45. Evan had left to investigate shortly after. But Dryden's boat showed signs of arrival much earlier, based on the tide marks and the temperature of the engine housing when I had tested it. "Mr. Wolfe," I said into the radio, "I believe Dryden arrived yesterday evening, well before the emergency signal. He was on or near this island for hours before anyone acknowledged his presence." "That suggests either deliberate concealment or coercion." "Or death," Wolfe replied. "If Dryden was killed shortly after arrival, someone else sent that signal. Someone who wanted to establish a timeline that would implicate the nephew. Return to your search, but examine the evidence more critically. Bodies on islands are usually hidden where tide and time will obscure the circumstances of death." The connection ended with a snap of static that seemed to punctuate his logic with uncomfortable finality. I looked at Harwick and Catherine, both showing the strain of too many hours without answers, and too many questions without comfortable explanations. We continued the search with new urgency, following the shoreline toward the rocky outcroppings where the island's eastern face met the sea in a jumble of boulders and tidal pools. The area was treacherous, slick with spray and seaweed, the kind of place where accidents happened and evidence disappeared with the changing tide. It was Catherine who found the briefcase, wedged deep in a crevice between two large rocks and half submerged in the rising water. It was battered and waterlogged, but the gold initials MD were still visible on the clasp. Marcus Dryden's personal effects, abandoned or discarded in a place where they might never have been discovered. I pulled it free and pried open the damaged lock. Inside, protected by waterproof lining, was another copy of the stolen analysis. This one bore no annotations, no operational planning, just the original theoretical framework that had started this entire disaster. 10 minutes later, moving carefully among the slippery rocks, I found what I had been dreading to discover. Wedged in a tidal pool and hidden from casual view by an overhang of stone was Dr. Marcus Dryden himself. He was face down, dressed in dark clothing that blended with the wet rock, and he had been dead for hours. The back of his head showed a nasty gash consistent with a fall or a blow from a blunt object. But what captured my attention was his right hand, clenched tightly around something small and metallic. I pried the fingers open carefully and found myself looking at a silver cufflink shaped like a stylized lion's head with tiny ruby eyes. I climbed back to where Hawick waited, his face gray with anticipation of bad news. "It's Dryden," I confirmed. "Dead several hours. Head injury." And he was holding this. I displayed the cufflink on my handkerchief. Hawick stared at it as if it were a personal accusation written in precious metal. "That belongs to Evan," he whispered. "Part of a set I gave him for his birthday. He was wearing them last night at dinner. The pieces were falling into a pattern, but it was a pattern that felt too neat, too convenient." Dryden dead, clutching Evan's cufflink. Evan missing, leaving behind a bloody flashlight and a sabotaged communication system. The stolen documents recovered near the body. It looked like a textbook case of confrontation and violence, with a clear victim and an obvious suspect. But something nagged at me. Something Wolfe had said about examining evidence critically. I used the radio again to report our discoveries. "The evidence points to a confrontation between Dryden and your nephew," I told him. "But the timeline troubles me. If Dryden arrived hours before the signal, why did no one see or hear his boat? If Evan killed him in self-defense, why destroy the communication system? If Evan killed him deliberately, why leave such obvious evidence?" "You are learning to think like a detective rather than a collector of facts," Wolfe said with what might have been approval. "The evidence is too theatrical, too perfectly arranged to tell a single story. Someone wants us to reach a specific conclusion. The question is whether that conclusion serves justice or conceals it." "What do you suggest?" I asked. "Find the nephew," Wolfe replied. "Alive, if possible. Dead, if necessary. But find him before someone else arranges the final act of this performance. The truth lies not in what evidence has been left for you to discover, but in what evidence someone hoped you would never find." The radio went silent, leaving us alone on the rocks with a dead man and a mystery that was becoming more dangerous with each revelation. Somewhere on Gull Point Island, Evan Hawick was either hiding in fear or lying in wait for his next victim. Either way, the morning was advancing, the tide was changing, and time was running out for all of us. I looked at the lighthouse standing white and silent against the gray sky, its beacon dark, but its secret still hidden. The emergency signal had brought us here, but I was beginning to suspect that the real emergency was just beginning. We left Dryden's body covered with a tarp from the boathouse, weighted with stones against the rising tide. The decision sat poorly with Hawick, who wanted to move his former security chief to more dignified surroundings, but I explained that crime scenes are delicate constructions, and disturbing them serves neither justice nor the deceased. Catherine stood at the edge of the rocks, staring down at the covered form with the pale intensity of someone who had just realized that professional competence offers no protection against violent death. The search for Evan intensified, with the understanding that we were now looking for either a murderer in hiding or a second victim waiting to be discovered. I divided the remaining areas systematically, keeping Catherine within sight and assigning Hawick the sectors closest to the main house. Trust had become a precious commodity, and I was not prepared to let either of them wander into situations where convenient accidents might occur. The island's interior contained surprises that our earlier reconnaissance had missed. Hidden by overgrown vegetation near the ridgeline, I found the remnants of an old military installation, a concrete bunker that had been carved into the rock during some forgotten war. The entrance was partially collapsed, but someone had cleared away enough debris to make passage possible. Fresh scuff marks in the accumulated dirt suggested recent and repeated use. I called the others over and we entered together, moving single file through the narrow passage that opened into a larger chamber. The interior smelled of damp concrete and something chemical that had no business being in an abandoned fortification. Someone had converted this forgotten relic into a sophisticated operational center. Multiple laptops hummed quietly on improvised tables, their screens glowing with real-time market data and trading platforms. Power cables snaked across the floor to a generator that provided independent electricity, and communication equipment occupied one entire wall. But what made my blood run cold were the screens themselves. Currency exchange rates, futures contracts, and a series of coordinated transactions that had been queued for execution. The amounts involved made Harwick's considerable wealth look like pocket change. Someone had prepared a systematic assault on international financial markets using the exact vulnerabilities outlined in the stolen analysis, and the trades were scheduled to execute at market opening in less than 2 hours. Harwick stared at the displays with the expression of a man watching his worst nightmares achieve consciousness and begin making appointments. "This is precisely what the theoretical analysis predicted," he whispered. "A cascade of coordinated trades designed to exploit temporary imbalances in exchange rates. If these transactions execute, they will trigger automatic responses that amplify the effect exponentially. Billions of dollars will be redistributed before anyone realizes what is happening. And Wolfe's methodology is referenced throughout the operational framework," I added, examining the documentation scattered across the tables. "When investigators trace the pattern, they will find specific citations to his Balkanian case and assume he either designed the scheme or provided the intellectual foundation for it. Either way, his reputation becomes collateral damage in someone else's war for financial supremacy. I photographed everything before examining the system more closely. The user authentication logs revealed something that changed my understanding of the entire situation. The primary account was registered to Catherine Voss, and the access timestamps showed she had been logged into the system as recently as 4 hours ago, well after Dryden's estimated time of death. "Miss Voss," I said quietly, turning the screen so she could see the evidence, "this system is authenticated with your credentials. Either you prepared these transactions, or someone with access to your accounts has been using your identity to commit financial fraud on an international scale." She met my gaze without flinching, but something shifted behind her eyes, a calculation that suggested she had been expecting this moment and was almost relieved it had finally arrived. "I discovered this installation yesterday evening," she said, her voice carrying the careful precision of someone who understood that her next words would determine whether she faced criminal charges or merely professional disgrace. "After Evan left to check the lighthouse signal, I came looking for him and found all of this already prepared and waiting. The transactions were queued, the systems were active. I have been trying to determine how to shut it down without triggering the execution protocols." "A convenient story," I observed, "but the authentication logs show you accessed the system at multiple points over the past week, not just yesterday. That suggests either you are lying about discovering it, or you have been monitoring an operation you knew was criminal." Before she could respond, a sound from deeper in the bunker made us all freeze. Footsteps, slow and uncertain, approaching from a passage we had not yet explored. I drew my gun and motioned for the others to stay back as a figure emerged from the shadows. Evan Harwick looked like he had been through a war and lost every major engagement. His clothes were torn and stained with dried blood. His face bore the kind of bruises that come from recent violence, and his right arm hung at an unnatural angle. But his eyes were alert, darting nervously between us, as if calculating distances and escape routes. "Uncle Preston," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Thank God you came. I've been hiding back there since last night, after what happened with Dryden. We helped him to a chair, and Catherine produced bottled water from the supplies scattered around the bunker. While he drank, I questioned him with the methodical persistence that Wolfe had taught me to apply to witnesses who had survived traumatic events. "Start from the beginning," I told him. "The emergency signal activated at 11:45. You went to investigate. What did you find?" "Dryden was there," Evans said, wincing as he shifted position. "In the lighthouse, destroying the communication equipment. He had a gun. Said I had ruined everything, that I was going to expose the operation before it could be completed. He attacked me. We fought. He fell, hit his head on the rocks. I was terrified. I thought he had accomplices. I ran and hid. It was a compelling narrative that explained most of the physical evidence we had discovered, but something about its neat alignment with the facts troubled me. I excused myself and used the radio equipment in the bunker to contact Wolfe directly. "You have found the operational center," he said after I described our discoveries. "The weapon that was prepared to destroy financial markets and implicate me in the process. But you have also found something more important. You have found the contradictions that reveal the truth beneath the performance." "I don't follow," I said. "The nephew's story is too convenient, Archie. It explains every piece of evidence perfectly, which means it was constructed to explain them. But consider the lighthouse logs. If Dryden arrived to sabotage his own communication system, why did he use Evans' access code to disable the remote monitoring 3 hours before the emergency signal? If his goal was secrecy, why activate a signal that brings people running?" I checked the lighthouse logs again, accessing them remotely through the bunker's communication system. Wolfe was right. The system had been accessed at 8:30 the previous evening using Evans' personal code, 3 hours before the emergency signal began. The access was used to disable external monitoring, creating a window of invisibility for whatever happened next. "Mr. Wolfe," I said into the radio, "I think the emergency signal was not a call for help. I think it was an alibi. A way to establish a timeline that would explain Dryden's death as self-defense rather than premeditated murder." "Precisely," Wolfe replied. "The nephew did not kill to protect himself. He killed to protect his operation. Dr. Dryden arrived not as a saboteur, but as an investigator. He discovered the financial weapon and attempted to shut it down. For that, he was murdered. Everything else is theater designed to conceal premeditation." I turned back to the group, where Evan was watching me with growing alarm. The game was ending, and he could see the final moves being played out on the board. "We need to have another conversation," I told him, "about timeline, access codes, and the difference between self-defense and murder. And this time, I suggest you tell the truth. Because Mr. Wolfe has already solved your puzzle, and my patience for elaborate fiction has been completely exhausted." The bunker fell silent except for the hum of computers counting down toward market catastrophe and the distant sound of waves against rock. Somewhere in the darkness of Gull Point Island, the truth was finally ready to emerge from its carefully constructed hiding place. Evans' facade cracked like ice under sudden pressure, the careful composure he had maintained throughout the night, finally collapsing under the weight of accumulated evidence and logical deduction. He tried to stand, favoring his injured arm, but the movement seemed to emphasize his vulnerability rather than project strength. His eyes darted between his uncle and Catherine, searching for allies in a room that had suddenly become hostile territory. "You don't understand the scope of what I created," he said, his voice carrying a note of desperate pride. "This isn't simple market manipulation. This is a complete restructuring of inefficient capital distribution using principles that Nero Wolfe himself established. The Balkanian case proved that currency markets could be influenced through strategic intervention." I simply extended that methodology to its logical conclusion. The logical conclusion of theft and murder, I observed, because that is what this amounts to, regardless of how you dress it in academic theory. You killed Dr. Dryden because he discovered your operation and threatened to expose it. Everything else is elaborate window dressing designed to conceal premeditated homicide. He looked at me with something between contempt and grudging respect, as if I were a student who had finally grasped a difficult concept but arrived at the wrong conclusion. Marcus was a relic, he said, a security chief who believed that loyalty meant preventing innovation rather than protecting it. When he found the operational framework, he called it criminal. He refused to understand that we were on the verge of demonstrating financial principles that could reshape global markets. He gave me no choice. There is always a choice between murder and alternatives, Catherine said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had worked closely with both men and was only now understanding the depth of the betrayal. You used my credentials to build this system. You made me complicit in fraud and murder without my knowledge or consent. Evan turned to her with an expression that mixed regret with calculation, as if he were genuinely sorry she had been hurt, but not sorry enough to change his actions. I needed administrative access that wouldn't trigger security reviews, he explained. Your credentials provided the perfect cover. If the operation had succeeded, you would have been rewarded. If it failed, the investigation would have focused on you while I managed the aftermath. It was nothing personal, Catherine. It was simply the most efficient distribution of risk. The casual cruelty of that admission seemed to drain the remaining warmth from the bunker. Harwick leaned against the concrete wall, looking older than his years and smaller than his reputation. The nephew he had trusted with sensitive research had murdered a loyal employee and framed an innocent woman to protect a criminal enterprise that would have destroyed everything the family had built. I moved to the radio equipment and established contact with the brownstone. Wolfe's voice came through the static with unusual clarity, as if the universe had decided this particular conversation deserved perfect transmission. Mr. Wolfe, I said, we have confirmation of premeditated murder and financial fraud. The perpetrator has confessed to killing Dr. Dryden and using Miss Voss's credentials to construct an automated trading system designed to manipulate currency markets. The trades are scheduled to execute in approximately 40 minutes. Wolfe's response carried the cold precision of a surgeon removing diseased tissue. The confession is satisfactory, but incomplete, he said. The immediate concern is preventing the execution of those trades. Examine the system architecture, Archie. Every automated mechanism requires authentication protocols. Find the override procedures, and you will find his weakness. I turned to the computer displays, where countdown timers continued their relentless progression toward market opening. Catherine joined me at the main console, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood complex financial systems. The authentication structure is sophisticated, she reported. Biometric confirmation required every 12 hours, with backup manual overrides that require administrative privileges. But there is something else. The profit distribution routes through a series of offshore entities that don't match any of Preston's corporate structures. I examined the ownership trail she had uncovered. The ultimate destination was a Cayman Islands holding company registered to EH Holdings, with Evan Harwick listed as the primary director. The entire operation was designed not just to manipulate markets, but to funnel the profits directly to accounts he controlled personally. Your nephew wasn't just stealing methodology, I told Harwick. He was stealing billions and planning to disappear with enough wealth to buy his own country. The attack on Wolfe's reputation was simply cover for the largest financial theft in history. Harwick stared at the screen displaying his nephew's betrayal, then turned to face the young man who had destroyed his trust and murdered his friend. You used my resources, my name, my theoretical work, he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute judgment. You killed Marcus because he was loyal enough to question your criminal enterprise. And you plan to leave me holding responsibility for international financial chaos while you disappeared with stolen billions. Evan met his uncle's gaze without flinching, and for a moment I saw the calculating intelligence that had made him dangerous. I plan to achieve something magnificent, he replied. To prove that intellectual superiority could reshape financial systems rather than merely analyze them. The profits was simply the means to continue the work on a larger scale. If you and Marcus had possessed the vision to support innovation instead of clinging to outdated ethics, none of this would have been necessary. The radio crackled, and Wolfe's voice cut through the tension with surgical precision. "Mr. Harwick, Jr.," he said, and the formal address carried more condemnation than any curse could have managed. "You have perverted my methodology, murdered an innocent man, and attempted to destroy my reputation while committing international financial crimes. You understand nothing of intellectual achievement. You have demonstrated only that intelligence without integrity is merely sophisticated criminality." The words hit Evan like physical blows. For all his planning and calculation, he had never anticipated facing direct judgment from the man whose work he had tried to steal. His composure finally shattered completely. "The system will execute regardless," he said, his voice rising with desperate defiance. "The authentication protocols are locked. Even if you destroy this equipment, backup servers will complete the transactions. In 30 minutes, the markets will crash exactly as I designed, and investigators will find your intellectual fingerprints throughout the operational framework." Catherine's fingers flew across the keyboard, accessing administrative functions with the focused intensity of someone who understood that minutes mattered. She pulled up system documentation and began examining the manual override procedures. "There is a master shutdown sequence," she announced. "It requires my administrative credentials, plus biometric confirmation from the primary user. But there is also an emergency protocol. If I can access the core authentication module, I can purge the entire transaction queue before execution." "Do it," Harwick ordered, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had built an empire and would not watch it destroyed by family betrayal. The screens began flashing warnings as Catherine navigated through security layers, each one requiring passwords and confirmations that she provided from memory. Evan watched helplessly as his carefully constructed weapon was systematically dismantled by the woman he had tried to frame for its creation. "Transaction queue purged," she reported. "All pending trades cancelled. The system is entering lockdown mode." One by one, the trading platforms went dark. The countdown timers froze and disappeared. The financial weapon that had threatened to destabilize international markets and destroy Wolfe's reputation had been defused with 18 minutes to spare. I contacted Wolfe to confirm the success and received instructions that carried the weight of inevitable justice. "Secure all evidence," he said. "Document everything, and bring the participants to New York immediately. This matter requires formal resolution in my office, where all parties can face the consequences of their actions under proper supervision. The authorities will be contacted at the appropriate time in a manner that ensures they understand the complete scope of the criminal conspiracy." The helicopter ride back to Manhattan was conducted in silence, broken only by the rhythmic beating of rotors and the occasional sound of Evan's shifting position as his injuries reminded him of the price of ambition. Catherine stared out the window with the blank expression of someone whose professional life had been saved, but whose trust in colleagues had been permanently destroyed. Harwick looked older than he had 12 hours earlier, as if the night had aged him in ways that no amount of wealth could reverse or repair. As we approached the city, I thought about Wolfe waiting in his office, preparing to deliver the kind of justice that courts could not provide and criminals could not escape. The case was solved, the weapon was defused, and the truth was ready to be delivered with the precision and finality that only Nero Wolfe could provide. But the real cost of this investigation would not be measured in prevented financial losses or preserved reputations. It would be measured in the silence that follows when trust is finally and irrevocably broken, and in the knowledge that some betrayals cut too deep for any amount of justice to heal completely. The brownstone felt like a sanctuary after the violence and deception of Gull Point Island, but it was the kind of sanctuary where final judgments are rendered rather than absolution granted. Fritz met us at the door with his customary discretion, taking coats and hats as if we were returning from a pleasant social call rather than a murder investigation. I guided our somber procession to the office, where Wolfe sat behind his desk in a fresh brown suit and yellow shirt, the combination he favors when serious work requires both stamina and precision. The office smelled faintly of orchid fertilizer and the beef stock that Fritz had been simmering to sustain his employer during our absence. I positioned the chairs with deliberate care. Harwick in the red leather client chair, Catherine to his left, where she could observe without feeling cornered, and Evan slightly apart, where I could maintain visual contact. The arrangement created a subtle hierarchy that placed Wolfe at the apex of authority and Evan in the position of a defendant awaiting verdict. Wolfe did not speak immediately. He studied our assembled group with the methodical attention he typically reserved for examining orchids that displayed unexpected mutations or criminal evidence that required careful interpretation. When he finally leaned back and steepled his fingers, the room settled into the peculiar silence that precedes one of his formal exercises in intellectual dissection. You have all been participants in a conspiracy that threatened international financial stability and resulted in murder, he began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute judgment delivered without emotion. Before I present my conclusions, I will hear from each of you. Brevity is not merely encouraged, it is mandatory. Mr. Harwick Sr., you first. Preston Harwick looked as if the helicopter ride had aged him another decade. His voice, when it came, was controlled by habit rather than confidence, the careful articulation of a man who understood that his words would determine his future. I engaged your services because someone had stolen a theoretical analysis that referenced your work and seemed likely to misuse it for criminal purposes, he said. I did not know that my own nephew had converted that analysis into an operational weapon, or that he had murdered Marcus when discovery threatened his scheme. I am responsible for creating the environment that enabled this tragedy, but I did not participate in the crimes themselves. Wolfe gave a small nod. A debit entered on the proper side of his mental ledger, then shifted his attention to Catherine. Miss Voss? Catherine sat with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, displaying the kind of composure that comes from having survived the worst and determined to face whatever follows with dignity intact. I managed Mr. Harwick's operations without knowledge of the bunker, the queued transactions, or the offshore accounts until last night, she said. When I discovered them, I attempted to understand how to shut down the system without triggering the execution protocols. Evan used my administrative credentials without my knowledge or permission. I did not kill anyone, and I did not intend to profit from market manipulation. Wolfe's eyes shifted to Evan with the kind of stillness that suggests a very large predator contemplating trapped prey. The young man straightened in his chair, summoning the remnants of his tattered dignity for what he must have known would be his final performance. "And you," Wolfe said. Evan met his gaze with a mixture of defiance and calculation, as if he were still searching for an angle that might salvage something from the wreckage of his ambitions. I developed a system that could have demonstrated the fundamental inefficiencies and vulnerabilities in current financial structures, he said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. Yes, I planned to benefit from it. Yes, I concealed it from my uncle because I knew he would lack the vision to proceed. When Marcus discovered the operation and threatened to destroy years of work, we fought. His death was not premeditated. It was the unfortunate result of his inability to understand the magnitude of what I had created. You insist on calling it an accident, Wolfe observed mildly. Yet the evidence resists that characterization. You lured Dr. Dryden to the island by stealing the analysis he had authored, knowing that his professional conscience would compel him to investigate. You disabled the monitoring systems using your personal access code hours before the emergency signal, creating a window of invisibility for your actions. You arranged the environment of the confrontation in an isolated location near treacherous rocks where accidents could plausibly occur. The outcome was not unforeseeable. It was, in fact, the only probable result of your careful preparation. Evan's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady as he continued his defense. Marcus was going to call the authorities immediately, he said. There would have been no opportunity to explain the theoretical foundations of the work, no recognition of the intellectual achievement involved. Only accusations of criminality from someone who could not comprehend the scope of what I had accomplished. You mistake your grievance, Wolfe replied, his voice dropping to the rumble that indicated genuine displeasure. Your true complaint is that the world values law above your self-assessed genius. You constructed an apparatus to steal on a scale that would have made historical bank robbers appear quaint by comparison. You armored it in references to my methodology to misdirect blame when investigators traced the pattern, and when a man of integrity attempted to prevent this theft, you murdered him and staged the scene to suggest self-defense. That is not theoretical achievement, Mr. Howick. That is butchery executed with academic footnotes. The words struck Evan like physical blows, and for the first time since we had found him in the bunker, his composure began to crack. Howick stared at his nephew with an expression of absolute devastation, finally understanding the complete scope of the betrayal. If you had approached me directly, Howick said, his voice rough with emotion, I could have funded legitimate research into market reform. We could have explored regulatory mechanisms, oversight improvements, structural changes that would benefit everyone rather than enriching a single individual through theft. Evan laughed once, a sound bitter enough to curdle milk. With committees, he said, his voice rising with frustrated rage. With oversight panels, compliance reviews, reputational risk assessments. You would have neutered the entire concept, Uncle Preston. Reduced it to another academic exercise that changes nothing and threatens no one. I needed freedom to act, not permission to study. Freedom is not the absence of restraint, Wolfe said with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. It is the presence of responsibility. You invoked my work while discarding the moral discipline that made it effective. In the Balkanian currency case, my purpose was to prevent theft, not to refine techniques for committing it more efficiently. You preserved only the mechanism while rejecting the ethical framework, like a surgeon who studies anatomy solely to learn where to place the knife for maximum damage. The telephone on my desk rang with a harsh insistence that suggested official business requiring immediate attention. I answered to find Inspector Kramer's voice demanding explanations for the anonymous report his department had received about a body on a private island and financial crimes that apparently involved Nero Wolfe. Inspector, I said after covering the mouthpiece and receiving Wolfe's nod of permission, Mr. Wolfe has information regarding a homicide that occurred last night on Gull Point Island. The victim was Dr. Marcus Dryden, former federal law enforcement officer. The perpetrator is currently in our office and will be made available to your custody along with complete documentation of the criminal conspiracy he attempted to execute. Kramer's response involved the usual threats about obstruction of justice and demands for immediate compliance with police procedures. I let him express his displeasure for 30 seconds before interrupting with the calm authority that comes from holding all the important evidence. All relevant parties are present and cooperative. I continued. Mr. Wolfe has solved the case and prevented an international financial crime. If you send detectives to the brownstone within the hour, you will receive a full confession, complete physical evidence, and documentation sufficient to close multiple cases including murder, fraud, and attempted market manipulation. Alternatively, you can continue expressing your concerns about proper procedure while I contact the federal authorities who will be extremely interested in the international aspects of this conspiracy." The line went quiet for a moment before Kramer's voice returned with the grudging cooperation of a man who recognized when his interests aligned with accepting help rather than demanding compliance. "1 hour," he said, "and everything better be documented properly, or Wolfe will be explaining himself to people who are less understanding than I am." I hung up and reported the conversation to Wolfe, who acknowledged it with a slight inclination of his head before returning his attention to Evan. "You will remain in this office under Mr. Goodwin's supervision until the authorities arrive," he said. "You will provide a complete confession detailing Dr. Dryden's murder, the construction of your financial weapon, and your attempt to implicate me in criminal activities. In exchange for this cooperation, I will ensure that investigators understand the full scope of your crimes, which may influence their decisions regarding charges and prosecution." "And what happens to my uncle and Catherine?" Evan asked, and despite everything, there remained a note of genuine concern in his voice that suggested some capacity for human feeling persisted beneath his calculating ambition. "They will face consequences appropriate to their failures," Wolfe replied. "Negligence is not murder, and passive complicity is not active conspiracy. But they will answer for their roles in creating conditions that enabled your crimes. Justice requires accountability at all levels, not merely punishment of the most obvious perpetrator." He turned to Preston Harwick with an expression that mixed condemnation with something that might have been sympathy for a man whose trust had been catastrophically betrayed. "You will cooperate fully with all investigations, provide complete restitution for damages, and restructure your organization to prevent future abuses," he continued. "You will also establish a memorial fund in Dr. Dryden's name, administered independently, to support families of security personnel killed in the line of duty. The amount will be sufficient to ensure that his sacrifice is remembered in practical terms rather than empty gestures." Harwick nodded slowly, accepting the judgment with the resignation of a man who understood he was receiving mercy disguised as justice. The hour passed in careful documentation and quiet preparation. Fritz brought coffee that remained untouched and sandwiches that sat ignored on their plates. Catherine stared at nothing, processing the destruction of professional relationships she had trusted. Evan provided his confession in the flat monotone of someone reciting facts that no longer held personal meaning. Preston Harwick signed documents with the mechanical precision of a man executing his own corporate obituary. When the police arrived, led by Inspector Kramer and accompanied by federal agents who had been briefed on the international implications, I provided them with evidence packages that Wolfe had prepared with characteristic thoroughness. Evan was taken into custody without protest, his injured arm finally receiving proper medical attention as he was escorted from the brownstone toward a future involving courtrooms rather than trading floors. After their departure, Wolfe sat in silence for several minutes, his eyes closed and his breathing slow and measured. Then he looked at me with an expression I had learned to recognize as his way of processing cases that revealed particularly disturbing aspects of human nature. "Archie," he said, "intelligence without integrity is merely sophisticated criminality. Ambition without ethics is simply elaborate theft, and methodology without moral foundation becomes nothing more than a weapon awaiting misuse by those who mistake cleverness for wisdom. These lessons should not require murder to teach, yet humanity persists in learning them through tragedy rather than reflection." It was as close to philosophical discourse as Wolfe typically permitted himself, and I recognized it as his method of processing a case that had threatened not only his reputation, but the principles underlying his entire approach to detective work. The brownstone returned to its customary silence, but it was a different kind of quiet now, the peace that follows after justice has been served and moral order restored. Somewhere in that ordered calm, I understood that we had prevented not merely a crime, but a perversion of everything Wolfe represented, and that victory carried its own weight of responsibility that no amount of beer or orchid cultivation could entirely dispel. The case was closed, but its implications would linger long after the last legal proceeding concluded and the final newspaper headline faded from memory. The morning after Evan Harwick's arrest brought the kind of deceptive calm that follows violent storms when the damage has been assessed but not yet repaired. The brownstone resumed its familiar rhythms with the cautious deliberation of a patient testing recently healed bones. Wolfe ascended to his plant rooms at 9 sharp. Fritz began preparations for a lunch that would restore order through the application of proper seasoning, and I settled at my desk to transform the previous night's chaos into the kind of documentation that satisfies both police bureaucracy and Wolfe's standards for precision. At 10:15, Saul Panzer arrived with the expression of a man who had been working while others were preventing international financial collapse. He settled into the red leather chair with his notebook already open, a sign that he had information worth the interruption of our post-crisis recovery. "You asked me to investigate Preston Harwick's background before you decided whether to take his case," Saul began. "By the time you were on that island, I'd uncovered something that explains how the nephew became so expert at weaponizing other people's research. He consulted his notes with the methodical precision that made him worth his considerable fees. 3 months ago, there was a professional break-in at a quantitative analysis firm downtown. Very clean work, no cash taken, just specific data files containing risk models and automated trading algorithms. Same month, someone penetrated the cloud storage of a think tank that had published research on systemic weaknesses in currency regulation. No police reports filed in either case. But both organizations quietly upgraded their security and bought additional insurance. Wolfe entered as Saul reached the crucial connection, settling behind his desk with the satisfied expression of a man whose orchids had behaved properly during their morning inspection. Both firms had done specialty consulting work for EH Holdings, Saul continued. Evan Harwick had been systematically collecting components from multiple sources before he ever saw Dryden's analysis. He was building his weapon piece by piece, stealing intellectual property from anyone whose work might be useful. So he was not merely a nephew who perverted a single document, Wolfe observed. He was a systematic thief of methodology, assembling criminal capability from fragments stolen across the financial research community. "There is more," Saul added. "The anonymous tip that brought Inspector Kramer to your attention yesterday morning. I traced it back through several layers of misdirection to a burner phone purchased with cash on 9th Avenue. The clerk remembered the buyer because she paid with a $100 bill and specifically asked about call masking features. Description matches Catherine Voss perfectly. I felt the pieces clicking into place with the satisfaction of a lock accepting the correct key. Catherine had called the police not from civic duty, but from calculated self-preservation, ensuring that any investigation would recognize her cooperation while forcing the matter into the open before additional evidence could implicate her more deeply. "She weaponized your reputation as an alarm system," I told Wolfe. "Knowing that Kramer would come straight to us if he heard your name connected to a body and a conspiracy." Wolfe absorbed this revelation without visible surprise, having already factored the possibility into his assessment of human nature and criminal behavior. "Prophylactic self-preservation," he said. "Not admirable, but understandable. She acted to sever herself from the conspiracy once its scope became undeniable." At 11:30, Preston Harwick returned to the brownstone with the uncertain posture of a man who was no longer confident that wealth guaranteed welcome anywhere. He carried himself like someone who had spent the night discovering that money could not purchase absolution for the consequences of misplaced trust. "I came to settle our account," he said, producing a checkbook with hands that showed a slight tremor. "And to ask a question that has been troubling me since your exposition." Wolfe named his fee without ceremony, then waited for the question with the patience of a confessor who had heard variations on the same moral uncertainties countless times before. "When you examined the evidence and identified my nephew as the murderer," Harwick began carefully, "I detected something in your reasoning that suggested you had considered alternative explanations before settling on the truth. Were there other suspects who might have been equally plausible?" Wolfe's expression sharpened with what might have been approval for the question's intelligence. "Indeed," he acknowledged. "Before the evidence conclusively established your nephew's guilt, I entertained the possibility that Miss Voss had constructed the entire operation and arranged circumstances to implicate him. The authentication logs could have been falsified by someone with her administrative privileges. The operational planning could have been her work, attributed to him through careful documentation. Even the murder itself could have been committed by her and staged to suggest his culpability." Harwick went pale, reassessing 6 years of professional relationship with a woman he had trusted implicitly. "But the evidence dismissed that theory," Wolfe continued. "Miss Voss's movements were accounted for by witnesses and physical evidence that could not have been fabricated. More significantly, the operational planning bore the intellectual signature of someone trained in financial analysis rather than administrative coordination. Your nephew's obsession with my methodology was documented extensively in his academic work. Miss Voss had no such fixation, no history suggesting the grandiose ambition that drives men to commit murder for theoretical vindication." He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried the weight of uncomfortable truth. "But I will confess that for several hours I considered the possibility seriously. That is the nature of detection, Mr. Harwick. We construct theories from incomplete information, test them against accumulating evidence, and abandon them when they prove incompatible with established facts. Certainty is the destination, not the starting point." Harwick wrote his check with the mechanical precision of someone performing a ritual that might restore some measure of order to a world that had revealed itself to be fundamentally unreliable. He placed it on Wolfe's desk, then sat back with the expression of a man who had learned more about human nature than he had wanted to know. "There is also the matter of Dr. Dryden's memorial fund," he added quietly. "I will arrange it tomorrow. Marcus deserves that recognition at least." After Harwick departed, carrying with him the burden of knowledge that trust once broken can never be completely repaired, the brownstone settled into the peaceful silence that follows when justice has been served and moral accounts have been balanced as completely as imperfect human systems allow. Fritz announced lunch with a satisfaction that suggested the morning's revelations had not disrupted his culinary schedule, and we moved to the dining room where proper food would restore the last frayed edges of order to our disrupted routine. The afternoon brought the final administrative details that close a case properly. I completed the documentation for Kramer and the federal prosecutors, ensuring that Catherine's cooperation was properly noted and that the full scope of Evan's systematic theft was clearly established. Wolfe dictated a character reference for Catherine that would help her find employment with people who valued competence over newspaper headlines. As evening approached and the city settled into its familiar rhythms of ambition and betrayal, I found myself thinking about signals and their meanings. Evan had activated an emergency beacon to provide himself with an alibi, but in doing so, he had signaled his presence at the scene. And his knowledge of systems, he should not have been able to operate. He had referenced Wolfe's work to legitimize his theft, but in doing so, he had signaled his insecurity and his need for intellectual validation, even while committing crimes. The case was closed, the criminal was in custody, and the financial markets had been preserved from catastrophe. In our profession, that constituted victory enough. Perfect justice exists only in the fantasies of people who have never faced the messy complexity of actual human behavior. But we had achieved something more valuable. We had prevented disaster through detection, restored order through logic. and demonstrated once again that intelligence applied with integrity could triumph over intelligence corrupted by ambition. Outside, the city continued its endless cycle of trust and betrayal, genius and criminality. Inside the brownstone, we had restored a small measure of order to chaos, and that was all anyone could reasonably expect or honestly claim to have achieved in a world where midnight signals could mean either distress or deception, depending on the character of the hand that sent them. 3 weeks after the resolution of the Gull Point Island affair, the brownstone had settled into its familiar rhythms with the deliberate precision of a fine timepiece that had been briefly disrupted but never damaged. Wolfe maintained his orchid schedule with religious devotion. Fritz achieved new heights of culinary perfection, and I managed our correspondence with the efficiency of someone who had learned that normalcy was something you earned through surviving chaos. The newspapers had covered Evan Harwick's arrest with breathless enthusiasm, treating it as a morality play about wealth, ambition, and the dangers of mistaking cleverness for wisdom. The federal prosecutors had issued carefully worded statements praising unnamed private investigators while avoiding mention of Nero Wolfe by name, a discretion he had requested and they had granted in exchange for his complete documentation. On a grey Thursday afternoon, Inspector Kramer arrived carrying coffee shop pastries and the expression of a man delivering news rather than complaints. I showed him to the office, where Wolfe was annotating a biography of Brillat Savarin with the concentration he usually reserved for prize orchids. "The federal case is proceeding smoothly," Kramer announced after declining beer and accepting coffee. "Full confession, complete documentation, enough evidence to convict him several times over. The prosecutors are calling it the most thoroughly documented financial conspiracy in their experience." He paused, and something in his manner suggested complications beneath the surface satisfaction. "There is one detail troubling the prosecutors," he continued. "During interrogation, Harwick claimed his entire scheme was inspired by studying your methods. Said he spent 2 years analyzing every case you had solved, looking for patterns he could adapt to financial manipulation. Defense attorneys might argue he was following what he believed were legitimate analytical frameworks." Wolfe closed his book with a measured care that suggested he had been anticipating this conversation and had prepared his response accordingly. "Mr. Harwick studied my methods the way a counterfeiter studies genuine currency," he said, "with attention to surface detail, but without comprehension of the principles that give the original its value. He observed that I use logic to expose hidden patterns, but failed to understand that the purpose of exposure is justice rather than exploitation. A surgeon and a murderer both understand anatomy, Inspector. The distinction lies not in their knowledge, but in their intent." Kramer absorbed this explanation with visible relief, recognizing something he could present to superiors who worried about precedent and liability. After his departure, Wolfe sat in contemplative silence, and I recognized the mood as one of his periodic assessments of human nature and its persistent tendency toward corruption despite available alternatives. "Archie," he said finally, "this case is concluded, but its implications persist. Somewhere in this city, another ambitious individual is studying my published work and searching for techniques that might be perverted to criminal purposes. That is the burden of effective methodology. Once demonstrated, it becomes available for misuse by those who lack the moral discipline that made it valuable originally." "So what do we do?" I asked. "Stop solving cases because criminals might study our methods. We continue our work with greater vigilance," he replied. "We document not merely our techniques, but the ethical framework governing their application. And we remain alert for those who invoke our names while violating our principles. The defense of reputation requires constant attention, not merely occasional intervention." The afternoon light was fading outside, casting long shadows across the office where so many confessions had been extracted and mysteries unraveled. Catherine Voss had found employment with a firm that valued competence over headlines. Preston Harwick had established Marcus Dryden's Memorial Fund with sufficient capital to honor his sacrifice for decades. Evan awaited trial in a federal facility where his intellectual pretensions would receive the kind of critical examination they had always deserved. Fritz announced dinner with the satisfaction of a man whose souffle had achieved perfect structural integrity. We moved to the dining room, where civilized conversation and proper seasoning would provide the final punctuation to a case that had threatened both financial stability and personal reputation. The brownstone settled into evening quiet, and in that ordered calm, I reflected on signals and their meanings. Evan had perverted a distress beacon to create an alibi, turning a call for help into a tool for murder. But we had read his signal correctly, decoded its true message, and sent our own reply through the proper channels. Tomorrow would bring new problems requiring attention, new criminals needing exposure, and fresh opportunities to demonstrate that methodology without morality was merely sophisticated criminality awaiting discovery. Tonight, we had earned our peace through work completed properly and justice served adequately. In our profession, that constituted victory enough, and we would accept it with the gratitude of people who understood that order was always temporary, always incomplete, and always worth pursuing despite those limitations. The check from Preston Harwick cleared the bank on Friday morning with the silent efficiency that characterizes high finance when it is not being manipulated by ambitious nephews with homicidal tendencies. It was a substantial sum, enough to keep the brownstone in orchids and beer for a considerable season, yet it did not seem to cheer Nero Wolfe. He spent the afternoon in the plant rooms, inspecting the phalaenopsis with a critical eye that suggested he found their symmetry suspect, and descended to the kitchen only when the aroma of Fritz's roast duckling became too compelling to ignore. Dinner was an affair of concentrated silence. The duckling was served with a sauce involving sour cherries and a hint of brandy that Fritz had been refining for 3 days, and for 20 minutes the only sounds in the dining room were the clink of silverware and the satisfied hum that Wolfe emits when food meets his exacting standards. It was not until the salad had been removed and the coffee served that he leaned back in his chair, regarding me with the expression of a man who has successfully defended his fortress against barbarian invasion, but resents the effort involved. "You are fidgeting, Archie," he observed, though I had not moved a muscle. "You have that expression which suggests you are chewing on a thought rather than your dinner. Spit it out so we may digest in peace." "It is the signal," I admitted. "The whole business with Evan Harwick using a distress beacon as cover for murder. He took a lighthouse, something designed to guide ships safely to harbor, and turned it into an instrument of deception. It takes a special kind of twisted thinking to look at a warning system and see an alibi." Wolfe nodded slowly, his eyes half closed in the manner that indicated serious consideration rather than approaching sleep. "It is the defining characteristic of the sociopathic intelligence," he said, "to see objects, systems, and people not as they are, but solely as instruments of utility. A lighthouse is not a warning system to such a man. It is merely a mechanism that emits light at intervals which can be timed and manipulated. A financial market is not a medium of exchange. It is a collection of vulnerabilities waiting to be exploited. And a mentor is not a guide. He is merely a resource to be mined and discarded when no longer useful." He lifted his coffee cup, the steam rising in the warm light of the dining room. "Evan Harwick suffered from the delusion that cynicism is a form of wisdom," he continued. "He believed that because he could deconstruct a system, he was superior to those who built it. He failed to understand that destruction is always easier than creation. Any fool can burn down a library. It takes genius to write a book. He copied my methods but missed the essential discipline that governs them. He thought he was signaling his brilliance to the world, but in reality, he was only signaling his own moral vacancy." "And Preston Harwick?" I asked. He paid our fee without complaint, but he looked like a man who had lost more than money. He built that empire, hired the security, bought the island, and installed all those protective systems. Yet he never saw the rot sitting at his own dinner table. Mr. Harwick committed the error of confusing loyalty with employment, Wolfe replied. He assumed that because he paid for fidelity, he possessed it. He surrounded himself with walls and electronic signals to keep enemies out, never suspecting that the greatest danger was already inside the perimeter, sharing his meals and studying his methods. It is a common failing of powerful men. They believe they can insure themselves against human nature through the simple expedient of writing larger checks. The dining room settled into comfortable silence, the kind that only exists in the brownstone when a case is closed, justice has been served, and the bank account reflects our success. Outside, the New York night was filled with its own signals, sirens, horns, the rumble of traffic carrying millions of people trying to communicate their presence in the urban darkness. Inside, we had restored our small circle of order to its proper functioning. I thought about Catherine Voss, starting over in a new position with employers who valued competence over newspaper headlines. I thought about the empty lighthouse on Gull Point Island, standing dark against the Atlantic, its emergency signal finally silenced. I thought about the difference between the messages we send and the ones people receive, between genuine distress calls and manufactured alibis, between intellectual achievement and sophisticated criminality. Wolfe finished his coffee and placed the cup on the saucer with a decisive click that indicated the evening's philosophical discourse had reached its natural conclusion. "The case is concluded, Archie," he said, pushing back his chair with the measured movements of a man satisfied with work properly completed. "The check is deposited. The criminal is incarcerated. The moral lessons, such as they are, have been distributed to those capable of absorbing them. I'm going to the office to read. I believe I've earned an evening without signals of any variety, distress or otherwise." He rose and moved toward the hall with the majestic dignity of a parade float navigating a narrow street. I watched him go, knowing that in 10 minutes he would be settled behind his desk with a book, the world locked out and his orchids sleeping peacefully upstairs, their roots secure in properly maintained soil. The brownstone was quiet now, filled with the kind of peace that follows when dangerous men have been removed from circulation and their schemes have been reduced to evidence files. Outside, the city continued its endless cycle of ambition and betrayal, but inside these walls, order had been restored through the application of logic, integrity, and sufficient beer to sustain the effort required. I finished my own coffee and stood up, listening to the familiar sounds of Fritz cleaning the kitchen and preparing for tomorrow's assault on culinary perfection. Somewhere in the darkness, other signals were being sent and received. Other deceptions were being planned and executed. Other crimes were waiting to be solved by those with the patience to separate truth from performance. But tonight, the detectives were off duty.